tongue and hold my breath. Scared to rock the boat and make a mess. So I said quietly, agreed politely. I guess that I forgot I had a choice.
Well, a very good morning. I see that we are a packed house again. So I just wanted to, of course, welcome you back to World Stage and tell you a little bit about what's going to happen for the rest of today in terms of our speaker engagements here. So coming up now, of course, we have Charles McClellan that's going to come back as part of our guest speaker series. And then returning at 2 p.m. will be Tim Runyon. I will be here at 3 p.m. To present what I call travel stories. This is where I kind of share some of my adventures of being in this position and some of kind of the crazy things that I've encountered along the way. So I hope you join me for that as well. And also enjoy all of the other things and events that we have going on here on board Koningsdam today. Now, without, what was I going to say? Sorry. Without I know that we have a packed house, as I mentioned. If you can find a seat, that's great. I know we have a little bit of maybe area up there in the, quote, VIP section. But I just want to let you know we are recording these talks, and we're going to try and see if we can't get them on the television. We normally do not do that, but we're working on that considering this has been such a popular event. So will you please welcome back to the stage Charles McClellan.
Good morning, everybody. Another beautiful day in paradise. And I wish to each one of you a joyful Easter. What a wonderful place to be on Easter Sunday. I've enjoyed meeting many of you already, and yesterday I had the really unique experience of meeting someone who grew up in the Panama Canal Zone about the same time that I did. And we were comparing notes, different teachers in high school and things like that. And he said that his father was an OBGYN surgeon at Gorgas Hospital. And I said, "What did you say your name was?" "Bob Strumpf." And I told him, "In 1962, your father saved my mother's life with an emergency operation." What a unique experience. What a wonderful experience. But I look forward to meeting more of you. Please say hello in the days ahead. Well, today we're going to be talking about the legacies of Rome. I'm going to, we covered the history of the world in 30 minutes in the first lecture. And so I'm going to be covering the history of Rome and the legacies of Rome in 30 minutes, a period of about 1,000 years. So this is very doable. It's only 1,000 years. And by the way, before I get started, it's sort of hard to determine of these things that I'll be talking about, the legacies, which ones actually originated in Rome, because they were adapters. They expanded their empire, and as they'd go into a new region, they'd see things that were really wonderful and worked well. They would adapt them and use them. So we're not sure how many of these things I'll be talking about today originated were originated by the Romans, or how many they actually adopted from other cultures. So here we go with a very brief history of the Roman Republic and Imperial Rome. This is a myth. Romulus and Remus, Latin mother, the war god Mars was the father. That second bullet there, placed in the Tiber River in a reed basket, sounds like something out of the Old Testament to me. Washed up on shore, raised by a wolf until found by a shepherd, and so on and so forth. Well, that's the myth. The reality is that a cluster of villages were geographically located together a few miles up the Tiber River. And around 750 BC, those villages decided to unite into a city-state. So they got together and they formed the original Rome. Now, the location of Rome, it's a very strategically excellent location. First of all, you notice the hills of Rome. The hills provided strategic advantage in case they were attacked. At this location on the Tiber River, it's the first place in the Tiber River as it ascends from the mouth of the river that can be spanned by a bridge. And coincidentally, there were major trade routes that came through this particular area. And also, they were 16 miles from the ocean, so close enough to get the benefit of ocean trade and fresh fish and so forth, but far enough away from the ocean to avoid the depredations of pirates. So that was Rome, the location, just 16 miles up from the ocean on the Tiber River. Now, this was a very important year, 510 BC. The Roman people of Rome threw off the shackles of a monarchy that had been in place for 200 years. Apparently the Etruscans, a warlike tribe that was nearby, had ruled over the Romans for a 200-year period. But in 510 BC, they became a republic. And as you can see, the derivation of the word republic means property of the people. And so at that period in time, the Roman Republic consisted of Rome. You can almost, that little red dot there, that's Rome at that period in time. But over the next 500 years, this Roman Republic would grow significantly. And let's talk about the way it was organized, first of all. And I think you're going to see a few things that relate to perhaps the world that we live in today. First of all, there was a Senate. That was the first governing body in the Republic. And look at the definition, senex, old, group of old men. I think that's true today in many respects. 300 to 500 of them. The number fluctuated apparently over this 500-year period from between 300 to 500. Most of the people in the Senate were the wealthy class, the patricians, landowning families, and so forth. Over this 500-year period, the Senate gradually had to, a new body was created, the plebeian council. The common people weren't represented really in the Senate, and consequently, they lobbied for and insisted upon their own legislative body. So this was the legislative assembly that the plebeians were able to use to represent themselves, and it passed laws and elected magistrates and tried judicial cases. So the Senate and the plebeian council were in effect the legislature. And the consuls were the executive branch. Consuls, most of the time there were 2 of them. They were elected each and every year. Wouldn't that be great if, that'd be awfully complicated to elect our president of the United States every year, but they elected consuls every year, 2 of them. And they were elected by the people, but the primary, so to speak, primary election took place in the Senate. And so the Senate really had a great deal of influence over who would eventually run for the office of consul and be elected. Now, the consuls also, in many cases, served as the commanders of the Roman army. And this is the Curia Julia. Curia means meeting house in Latin. Julia is related to Julius Caesar. And this, you can see this in Rome in just a few days here. It was built around the year 44 BC. And so from that point forward, the Senate and the plebeian council met in this particular building. And now I'm going to go through, I'm going to hit a few milestones. We're going to cover this 500-year republic period fairly quickly. And I probably left out a few things that perhaps some of you felt I should have included. I apologize. But in the sake of time, I had to limit the number of items that I'm addressing. In 450 BC, the Law of 12 Tables were published, and those were important because for the very first time, they codified the laws of Rome and established the rights of citizens. Construction of the Appian Way, which was the first of the major highways that was built by the Roman Republic, began in 312 BC. Now, perhaps of all of the things I'll talk about, you're probably a little bit more familiar with the Punic Wars than some of these other things. The Punic Wars were wars between Rome and Carthage. Rome had taken over the Italian peninsula. As you can see there, the dark purple, that was Rome. And just across the way there at the top of Africa is Carthage. Carthage was the premier maritime power of the world at that point in time. So there were these two major power bases, and eventually they came into conflict with each other. And there were a series of 3 different wars over that period of time. Rome won each of those wars. Perhaps the part of this that you're more familiar with than other parts is Hannibal's invasion. And you'll notice it's in green. It's that green line that goes up the eastern side of the Iberian Peninsula and over the Alps and down into Italy. This army led by Hannibal was very successful, but they won a lot of battles, but they were not able to defeat the Romans. And he had to go back to Carthage without having totally defeated the Romans. But a third war took place. That was the second war. Third war took place. And at the end of the third war, Carthage ceased to exist. The entire city was destroyed, and the Romans made sure there would never be another Carthage. They totally destroyed it. But as you can see, over this period of time, the Roman Republic really spread out quite a bit as they were eliminating their competition in Carthage. And as you can see, it spread out to the Iberian Peninsula, northern Africa, along the Adriatic, into current-day Greece. Spartacus' rebellion. By this point in the history of the Republic, there were more slaves in the Republic than there were freemen. And Spartacus, who was a gladiator, led perhaps the largest and most successful of the various slave rebellions that took place during the period of the Roman Republic. Led this revolt. 30,000 slaves and gladiators came together, and they fought the Roman army. Tragically for them, they were not successful. Spartacus was killed on the field of battle, and 6,000 of the surviving slaves were crucified on the Appian Way, and their bodies were left there as a warning to any other slaves or gladiators who were interested in rebelling, that this would be their fate if in fact they did. Julius Caesar came to power about 49 BC. He was a very, very successful general. He had 10 legions, large groups of Roman soldiers, and he was in the area called Gaul, current-day France, and won some fairly spectacular battles against the Germanic tribes, and became very, very popular with his men. And he would always make sure that his victories in the field were publicized in Rome, so that he became quite the celebrity of the day. He had major political ambitions, and the Senate was very much frightened of his power, his influence, his popularity with the common people. And they warned him, stay on the other side of the Rubicon. The Rubicon was the river that divided Italy and Gaul, or France. And there was a law on the books that said if a general crossed the Rubicon with his army, he then would be committing an act of treason. He could come home without his army, but don't bring your army with you, because obviously he would be intent on seizing power if he brought his army with him. Well, this sort of back and forth power struggle between the Senate and Caesar went on for a number of years until he finally did cross the Rubicon. A civil war ensued. The opposing General Pompey was supported by the vast majority of the Senate. In fact, the people who supported Caesar had to escape at night from Rome in order to avoid being killed by the supporters of Pompey. Well, he was successful and a very gracious winner. He didn't have any retribution against the people who had fought against him. And he found a way to establish his power by being appointed dictator. Now, that term has a very negative connotation in our world today, but back then it just meant a magistrate who rules the republic in times of emergency. So it was just sort of a temporary title, although he was given it for 10 years. But within 2 years, the 10-year limitation was taken away, and he became dictator for life. So clearly, the relationship between the executive branch, the consul, he was a consul by that time. Again, he was a consul on a number of different times. But the relationship of power, the shift of political power from the Senate and the plebeian council to this authoritarian leader was shifting significantly. And the end of the Roman Republic, that experiment in democracy, was coming to an end. He became appointed dictator for life. But he had many enemies in the Senate, as I indicated. And within just a matter of months after he had gotten the title of dictator for life, he was assassinated. He was assassinated by Marcus Brutus and Cassius. They cornered him in the Curia Julia, pulled their daggers out from their togas, and stabbed him to death. What an abrupt end. They figured that that would be the end of this experiment in an authoritarian leader. But no, it was just the beginning. So let's look for just a moment why there was this shift from the power of the legislative bodies to an authoritarian ruler. Why the Roman Republic came to an end at that point in time. A number of things had happened. First of all, what had started that Roman Republic was just a city government, if you will, initially. But as the empire expanded, that city government really wasn't set up to be able to govern this widespread empire that went up for thousands and thousands of miles. So that's one reason. That form of government just wasn't going to work for such a large territory. The generals out in the field that were on the borders and expanding the empire, they were very independent sources of power. Their legionnaires, their battle-hardened veterans, were loyal to them rather than to the government back in Rome. And that gave them a lot of power. The privileged classes abused their power, and the plebeian council wasn't as effective as the common people had hoped. And consequently, there was a lot of unrest among the common people. That was actually increased as wealthy landowners drove small farmers from public land. See, these wealthy landowners had a lot of slaves, and so the farming could be done by their slaves. They then took over more and more land, and consequently, a lot of people, small farmers, were without employment. And so this created a situation of civil unrest. Along came Octavian. He was the nephew and adopted heir of Julius Caesar, apparently a man of remarkable capability because at the young age of 19, he was elected to be a consul, which was really quite an unprecedented situation. Well, Octavian took upon himself the title Augustus. Augustus means revered, venerable. He chose that. I guess he didn't have an ego problem. But he was really, probably, of all of the emperors of Rome, the most capable. He made sure that the laws were updated and made sure that the borders were secured. They embarked on this major public building campaign, major buildings and roads and aqueducts and so forth. And his reign initiated a period of time called Pax Romana, which means the Roman peace. It was a period of 200 years of relative tranquility and peace throughout the entire Mediterranean world that was under the power of Rome. It was a high watermark in terms of literature, art, architecture, and religion, because it was a period of peace, and so all of these different kinds of things, culture and so forth, could flourish. Individual provinces, as long as they paid their bills, their taxes, they were pretty much left alone. They were permitted to have their own laws and their own religions and so forth and so on. The Romans didn't force them to accept Roman law. They just made sure, pay your taxes on time and be loyal to Rome. And so it was during this period of 200 years that there was great peace and tranquility within the empire, and it expanded significantly. So you look at that, the green is the Roman Empire by the time that Augustus died. It was enormous. It was most of the known Western world. And then a little bit later, the purple territories were added as well. And so, as you can see, just the entire Mediterranean area, and not as far as Britain as well, were dominated by the Romans. And perhaps, I don't know, the name Augustus, perhaps you're a little bit familiar with it. His name is mentioned in the Bible. You've read that many times. This is the man that we're talking about. And as you can see, Judea, at the far right hand of the Mediterranean, was under Roman power. Well, leapfrogging ahead quite a bit, the Pax Romana became history. The emperors became real dictators. They had total power by that time. Initially, at the very beginning, there was a little bit of a power-sharing arrangement, and the Octavian was able to consolidate his power by telling the Senate and the plebeian council, you guys still are important, you still have these important authorities and so forth, but it was just lip service. All of the power was in the emperor. By 285 AD, apparently it became ungovernable. It was just so much area, very, very difficult to govern that entire area. And so the Roman Empire was split between the Western and the Eastern Empire by Emperor Diocletian in the year 285 AD. And in subsequent years, there were civil wars, and those two different empires fought each other, and at brief periods of time, they were reunited, but then they broke apart again. So there was a lot of flux during this period of time. But generally speaking, the Roman Empire was divided into these two sections. Now, Constantine, in the year 306, this was another major milestone in the Roman Empire. Up to this point in time, the Christians were a despised and persecuted minority in many locations in the Roman Empire. He had a vision as he was going to a major battle, a cross up in the sky, and he felt like this was a message, a divine message to him, that he should stop persecuting the Christians and let them alone. So he decriminalized Christianity, became its patron. Not sure whether he joined a Christian group at that point in time, but at the very least, the Christians were able to worship in peace. And 410 AD, the Visigoths, one of the warlike Germanic tribes that had been always fighting all of these centuries, there was always trouble along the northern border. They sacked Rome, and that was really sort of the end of the end, so to speak. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. But the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years. So we can't say the Roman Empire ended in 476 AD, only the western part. The eastern part continued on for many centuries. So, why did the Roman Empire fall? Now, this has been the subject of controversy and different opinions by scholars and historians for centuries, and these are just a few of the different potential reasons why the empire fell. The vastness of the territory, so many different cultures and people, it was just too difficult to govern. Economic difficulties. The government was spending more, the support of the armies and these public infrastructure projects that they were building, they were, in effect, running the government on debt. And so there was inflation. They started to try and tax people more in order to get more money coming in, and it just sort of spiraled downward. The government had overspent. It had spent more money than it actually had. government corruption, political instability. There was all of this infighting going on back and forth between the emperors and the Senate and the plebeian council and so forth. There was still a lot of that going on. And then, but very importantly, all of that sort of set the stage for the invasion of the barbarian tribes from the north, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, and so forth. They had existed for a long period of time, and they'd been able to adopt the battle tactics of the Romans, had been able to get some of the weapons and so forth that the Romans used. And so the superiority of the Roman legions was no longer a fact. The Germanic tribes were superior to them. So that is the short Cliff Notes version of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. So now let's look at the legacies of Rome. By the way, I put these in the order, there are about 20 or so of them, order of importance, at least from my perspective. And so Christianity was that the seed of Christianity began around the period of when the Pax Romana began. And you can see the dark blue areas. Those were sort of places where different small groups of Christians took root. And then it expanded, as you can see, to the sort of turquoise area and to the green area as well. So in effect, the area of the Roman Empire became an incubator for this very young religion. And it may not have grown as quickly or as greatly as it did without being in that environment. And so it is today that Christianity is the largest religion in the world. 31% of the earth's inhabitants are Christian. Oops, went too fast. Number 2, language. Some languages are called the Romance languages. Roman, Romance, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French, Romanian. As you can see, Spanish is number 2. Portuguese is number 6. French and Italian didn't make the list, it looks like. These are the top 10 languages in terms of the number of people who speak them in the world. So a lot of people are speaking language that was based on Latin. English was not a Romance language, but about 60% of the English language is actually based on Latin. Take a look for just a minute. I'll stop talking for a minute. Take a look at the left-hand column and the right-hand column. Give you some examples. So, even though we're not, those of us who speak English, we're not speaking a Romance language, we are speaking many of the words, in fact, most of the words that we are speaking have some root in the Latin language. Number 3, the Republican form of government. This idea of checks and balances between the executive and the legislative branches of government that originated in the Roman Republic. The legislative bodies make the laws, control the budgets. The head executive, president in the United States, can be removed by the legislators through an impeachment process, are the leaders of the military, veto power, and they are charged with enforcing the laws. So this pattern was established in the Roman Republic. And there we have the White House on the left and Capitol Hill on the right. And let's look at a couple of other interesting things. First of all, that's called Capitol Hill, isn't it? One of the 7 hills of Rome. And look at the architecture of the Capitol. St. Peter's Basilica was the model that was followed. Number 4, Roman criminal and civil law. Many of the terms that we use in courts today, subpoena, habeas corpus, pro bono, affidavit, and so forth, are actually Latin terms. And the meaning of those terms originated in the Roman Republic. I mentioned a few minutes ago the 12 tables. The writers of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were heavily influenced by the 12 tables. Another document that I did not mention earlier that came along a little bit later, the Corpus Juris Civilis, many modern legal concepts, including the very revolutionary idea that the accused is innocent until proven guilty. That is quite unique, and it was based on Roman law. Number 5, social welfare. They had the first welfare state, if you will. Now, before I get into this, let me explain. They weren't motivated by a love of mankind and a desire to help the downtrodden. Basically, the welfare state in Rome was a way of keeping the common people happy and sort of buying them off a little bit. Healthcare. The first public hospital constructed on Tiber Island. And they pretty much had free health care, nominal charges for diagnoses and prescriptions. People who served in the military got a discharge pension. And there was a food assistance program, including these different aspects: distribution of free grain, rice and wheat and other barley and so forth. They had a means test. You had to meet certain criteria in order to receive the free grain. Initially, the 150,000 people met the means test, so it was fairly liberal. A welfare program that helped orphans and poor children. And they even had food stamps. Although they called them tesserae, the poor people were given these tokens, and then they were redeemable at central locations where they could pick up the rice or the wheat or whatever. Price controls on corn, oil, wine, and bread and pork, and so forth. So there was a major effort to buy off the common people by providing them bread. And there was a term that was coined by one of the Roman writers of the time, bread and circus. Perhaps you've heard that term before. This is the bread part. Circus we'll be talking about when we talk about the Colosseum. But social welfare was a very important innovation. The Julian calendar, named after Julius Caesar. Regular year of 365 days, 12 months. Leap day added to February every 4 years. That's what we have today, almost. It was off by 11 minutes a year. And so later on, centuries later, the Gregorian calendar was developed that took care of that. It's a little bit too complicated to cover today. But at any rate, that corrected that 11-day discrepancy. But let's look at the names of the months. And when you think about these names after today, you're going to be thinking about them differently. The first 6 months of the year are named after gods and goddesses. Take a look at the first 6. And then July and August are named after individuals, Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. Now the last 4, it's a little tricky. What you need to understand is that the original Roman calendar only had 10 months. The new one had 12. So what did they do? They took the names of the last 4 months of the 10-month calendar and pasted them on as the last 4 months of the 12-month calendar. So September is 7th month, even though it's the 9th month, and so forth, October and so on. So in effect, they took this portion of the 10-month calendar, pasted it on at the very end. So those are the names of the months of the year. Again, a legacy of Rome. The Roman numeral system. Well, you may be asking, Charles, why are you even including this? People don't use Roman numerals anymore. And anytime you see one, you're thinking, oh my gosh, what is that? Anyway, XXL, blah, 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 and so forth. It's sort of an alien thing. But we do see Roman numerals today, sometimes. At the end of a movie, by the way, or at least the credits for the movie, it's always in Roman numerals, and everyone's trying to think, okay, what year did that movie come out? And you're trying to do this conversion in your mind. But once a year, everybody starts to try and figure out, what do the Roman numerals stand for? The Super Bowl. It's always a Roman numeral, isn't it? And don't ask me what that means. Okay, bound books, number 8. They called them codices, and I used that term when we were having the Aztec Cortez lecture just recently. The benefit, the advantage of bound books over scrolls, tremendous advantage. You can imagine, if you're trying to read a particular section of a scroll, you've got to roll the whole thing out and try and find it somewhere. Whereas if you have a bound book, you can flip through it very easily. The bound books were much more durable. They didn't wear out the way scrolls wore out. Initially, this is a picture of one of the original bound books. It's actually a frame around a wax tablet. And you can see the scratching on the wax there. Apparently they could recycle that, warm up the wax, and you have a brand new book. But eventually, in time, the wax was replaced by parchment or animal skins. But this was, some historians say this was, next to the invention of printing, it's the most important advancement in the history of books. Newspapers. They had newspapers, my goodness. Those are the kinds of things that were recorded in the newspaper, the latest, what's happening on the borders, how are our legions doing, and fighting the Germanic tribes and so forth. They had, in effect, an entertainment section. This is the schedule of events at the Colosseum so that everybody could plan their schedule. So instead of having the schedule of cable programs, they had the list of games and gladiatorial bouts. They had an obituary as well as and birth notices, human interest stories, and so forth. Now, this wasn't the kind of newspaper that a boy would roll up on his bicycle and throw on your doorstep in the morning. It was chiseled in stone and placed at locations within Rome where there were a lot of people passing by. And so they were able to catch up on these kinds of things by reading the newspaper. Sculptures. Now, I'm going to cover art a little bit here. The Romans were very good at adapting things that they inherited from other cultures. So on our left there, you've got 2 sculptures from Greece. Greece sculptures, generally speaking, focused on the gods and had a very idealized version of the human body, as you can see. Just beautiful, but very idealized. There aren't too many people with that kind of physique. On the right are some examples of Roman sculptures. Much more realistic, a few more wrinkles in them, perhaps larger waistlines, and also emperors and wives of emperors and so forth, not just gods and goddesses. Fresco paintings. Perhaps, I'm sure that as you go through many of the museums in Rome, you're going to see fresco paintings. Fresco, by the way, let me define that. What they would do is they would plaster a wall with lime plaster, and then while it was still wet, they would paint the pictures on the wall. And as the plaster dried, it would set the paint. And consequently, they are still very beautiful and colorful today because they were set along with the plaster. Mosaics, another art form that the Romans perfected. These weren't that common. They were in the large villas and perhaps some of the public areas, but they were absolutely magnificent. As you can see, very, very intricate. It really took a long time to be able to create a mosaic, but they persist until today. In fact, just 2 months ago, on the island of Cyprus, in February of this year, they uncovered this mosaic, a 30-foot long mosaic of a chariot race. You can see the horses on the right-hand side there. Perfectly preserved. Beautiful, just magnificent. The Romans were the first ones to perfect the use of concrete. Now, their concrete wasn't as strong as the concrete that we use today, But nonetheless, it was a major advance in terms of building materials. You can see the different component parts of concrete. And that second ingredient, volcanic ash, apparently it created a concrete that could set in salt water. Very, very unusual. It created a chemical composition that enabled the concrete to become hard even though it was immersed in salt water. And therefore, the concrete was very good at building piers and things of that nature in the ocean. And the concrete enabled the Romans to build the Colosseum and the Pantheon and these other really huge buildings. Concrete enabled them to do that, as well as architecture. Notice arch in architecture. Arches, they pioneered the use of arches. Arches distribute weight among different supports so that large structures such as the Colosseum don't collapse, because you'll notice that the whole outer perimeter are arches. And so this was a major innovation in architecture. And those arches came in very handy with bridges. That bridge in the lower side there is in Rome. Ponte dell'Angelo, I think it is. The Castel dell'Angelo is at the end of that bridge. And so some of you will be walking over that bridge in just a short period of time from now. Those bridges still exist because they were so well built. Aqueducts brought water from as far as 60 miles away. Really quite a remarkable thing. And look at them. They still exist today. This is one that's in France. Got to look at my watch, 11:40. Got a few more minutes. I need to finish before you start getting too hungry. So let's keep moving right along here. Domes, still talking about architecture. Domes enabled the Romans to bridge large expanses. And this is a picture of the Pantheon dome. That's what it looks like from the outside on the left, the inside. 142 feet in diameter. And if you go into the Pantheon, you'll notice that a sphere exactly 142 feet in diameter would fit underneath the dome. Remarkable. The building capacity, the ability to create the plans for a building like this, and it's still with us today, centuries later. Roads and highways. The empire was really huge, and they had to have a way to move their legions from one part of the empire to another. Also, these highways were very important in terms of trade, and so 50,000 miles of roadway were built. And some of them, in fact, many miles, are still in use today. That's a picture of the Appian Way again. And they were so durable because they were built according to a particular plan. Take a moment to process that. And so if you walk on the Appian Way, you're walking on or any other Roman road. It's built according to this plan. And there were road signs, mile posts or kilometer posts that indicated where you were on your journey. Communal baths. A bath was a very important part of the daily schedule for Romans. And by the way, the picture in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of the Roman bath located in Bath, England. That's why it's called Bath. Apparently there's a hot spring there that provides 115 degree Fahrenheit water, and so it's still available there today. So they would go to these baths once a day or thereabouts, and on the left-hand side at the bottom is a mural. Those almost look like flip-flops on the center left there. And on the right here, there are a couple of very important bathing implements. In the container, they would put olive oil, and the scrapers were called strigils. What they do is they pour olive oil on people and scrape it off. So I guess the water got a little oily after a while. Central heating, large villas, as well as baths, they had a way of heating those areas. And this is a picture of a building that had central heating. Medical tools and techniques, they pioneered field surgery. They developed a lot of techniques, a lot of different tools, medicinal tools, medical tools. By the way, think about the next time you hear the word cesarean section, you'll know where it came from. A lot of different tools, and this was one tool. When I read about it, I sort of shuddered. Anyone want to guess what that is? It's a catheter, a bronze catheter. Okay, grid-based settlements. They had plans, streets at right angles to each other, generally constructed near forts. By the way, the name for fort is castra. And so if you're in England and you are in Winchester or Manchester or Lancaster, you are in Roman settlements because the word Chester or Castor is associated with the Roman fort. They had apartment complexes, sometimes as high as 6 stories high, and they called them insulae. Insula, singular, is an island. This is where the lower class and middle class people lived. They had public toilets. They didn't have indoor plumbing, so they had to go to a public toilet, and I think as I looked at that picture, boy, if you had a bashful bladder, this would be very difficult. Running underneath the toilet was water from an aqueduct, and it emptied into sewers. They invented sewers. This is the Cloaca Maxima, the largest sewer of the ancient world. It emptied into the Tiber, of course. They had glass windows. They weren't transparent, so they were pretty much for covering openings rather than letting a lot of light in, but they did let some light in. They had a postal service. And apparently, it was sort of like the Pony Express, if you will. At periodic intervals on the highway, there would be these stations or forts where they could replenish with fresh animals. And finally, this is the last one, they had fast food restaurants. And this is actually from Pompeii, so this is what it actually looked like. Nobody had a kitchen in their home, so they'd go out for dinner. And instead of ordering 2 beef patties with a special sauce and lettuce, tomato, and onions and so forth, this is what you might order. This might have been on the menu. So that brings us to lunchtime and the end of our talk today. And I hope you'll come back tomorrow for the Age of Exploration. Thank you.